Okay. Hi, everybody. It is 7 o'clock, so it's time to get started. So I just wanted to welcome you to our second Conversations with the Bible. And for those of you who are new, so you were unable to join last week, this is a 1 hour session where you'll hear from biblical scholars as they share their work on a range of topics. For those who don't know me, I'm Marianne, and I'm the priest at Christ Church Anglican in Grand Prairie. Before we get started, and I welcome our speaker, Fred, just a few housekeeping notes. If you weren't here last time, to just please keep your microphone muted. And if you're not muted, I will likely come and mute you because I can do that. And if you have any questions, just use the raise hand function. I'll leave it to Fred. You can moderate when you want questions or start discussion, whatever. And if you don't know how to use the raise your hand, just like physically raise your hand, but you got to have your video on to do that. Otherwise, I won't know that you're raising a hand. So I think that's everything. Are there any questions before we begin? And so this is recorded. If you want to go back to anything or if you've missed a session, it's always recorded and it'll be posted on the Christ Church YouTube channel. So today, I'm really delighted to welcome our guest speaker, who's Dr. Fred Tappenden. He is the principal and dean and professor of scriptures and sacred stories at St. Stephen's College at the University of Alberta. Fred's work focuses on issues of embodiment, cognition, social memory, and metaphor in religion, with a particular emphasis on ancient Christianity and ancient Judaism. Fred has written extensively and taught extensively. One of his books is Resurrection in Paul, Cognition, Metaphor, and Transformation. I have known Fred since my time in Edmonton, where we attended the same church, and his kids were in children's ministry with me. And I will never forget, Fred, when Olivia brought Blackjack, her hamster, to our pet blessing in this massive hamster enclosure outside, and all the little kids were peering in at Blackjack. And then your son Lucas said, "When I have a hamster, I'm going to name him Red Jack." And I was like, "Oh my gosh, he was so cute." Really cute kids. So I'm really grateful now that I get to work with Fred at St. Stephen's. And I know today's presentation is going to be amazing. I've seen the slides and I am super excited for it. So with that, I will hand over to Fred. Thank you so much, Fred.
Thank you, Marianne. Um, so Marianne has all the power. She can mute us at will. So if all of a sudden my mic cuts out, it's because she didn't like something I said and she decided to silence me. I'll be a bit on edge here, I think. No, I'm joking. It's really nice to gather with all of you tonight and to spend a bit of time together. As Marianne said, my background is as a scholar of the New Testament. My PhD was on the writings of the Apostle Paul. And then I did a postdoc when I was done my PhD. I did that at McGill University, working on some of the early reception of Paul's writings. And I know Marianne sold all of you on me talking about Paul tonight. And we're going to start with a little bit of Paul, but we're going to pivot into a much sort of larger question about the Bible itself. Really a fundamental question. How did we get the Bible? I mean, how did it come down to us? Here, I've got a copy of the Bible here, right? Bound together in a single volume. If I open it up, I can take a look that it's written in English, right? Well, there's lots of questions that we could get into here. How did we get the Bible? Probably means a question like who translated it? Because it wasn't originally written in English. It was originally written in Greek for the New Testament and Hebrew and Aramaic for the Old Testament. Why did these books that are in the Bible get selected and not other books? That's a question of canonization. And those are great questions we could get into, but I really want to get into the question about, let's say, the materiality of the Bible, the physical manuscripts that we have. How are those manuscripts written, passed down, preserved, and sort of passed along until someone collected them together and translated them into English, and we've got now this copy in front of us. So that's what I'm hoping we can get into tonight. We'll start with a bit of Paul, and that'll be a launching pad for us into that topic. Can I just ask, do any of you have Bibles with you tonight? I'm putting you on the spot. Okay. Owner, I'm sorry, I don't know your don't know your name, but I'm glad you've got a Bible. If anyone else does, maybe take a second to go find one, or you can pull up Bible Gateway online or some other online Bible, because I'm going to ask you all to turn to a verse in a second, but I'll just plant that seed there. I've got some slides. Let me share my slides, and we can go from there. Can you all see that? I'll take a thumbs up. Yeah, okay, looks good. All right. Title of my talk tonight, It Didn't Fall from Heaven. It's not like all of a sudden it came down, preformed like this, bound together, published by HarperCollins, as if HarperCollins were the direct imprint of the heavenly gift of the Bible. It didn't fall from heaven. We're going to explore the materiality and the textual history of the New Testament tonight. And I've given us this beautiful image here. This is a painting, uh, or I'm not sure it's actually a painting or it's a print, but by an artist from Israel. Her name is Lika Tove. Now, Lika is uh, the partner of a scholar, an Old Testament scholar named Emmanuel Tove, a Hebrew Bible scholar named Emmanuel Tove. Emmanuel Tove is one of the foremost authorities on the Hebrew Bible, particularly on the Dead Sea Scrolls. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in the Judean desert back in the middle of the 20th century, uh, they were collected together, and a certain group of scholars were allowed to access the scrolls and to start to publish the scrolls. And for the last 40 years, in our world today, one of the primary scholars who does that is a man named Emmanuel Tove. And his wife happens to be an artist. And when I was in grad school, Emmanuel came and gave a couple talks at the university I was at, and his wife came along with a ton of her art, and she was selling much of it. And she does these incredible pieces that are inspired by the scrolls. Let me put that a little differently. Inspired by the materiality of ancient texts, like the physical objects, the vellum on which they're written, the characters and the letters. And so you can see in this particular piece of art here, you can see this kind of a scroll, the edge of a scroll going through here, and then here it rolls back on itself. See that? Okay. And you can see now in this case, this would be Hebrew or Aramaic, a Semitic language, but you can see the writing of the scroll along there, right? Okay. So she does this artwork that's inspired by the scrolls. And this is a really beautiful image that I love to show when I've given this talk before, because it's the image of a scribe at work, right? A scribe sitting at a desk with a quill and ink, copying out a manuscript. That's part of what we're going to get into here, this materiality of how the text came down to us. Okay. Tonight we want to talk about how we got the Bible. How did these texts transmit down to us? How did they come down to us? To do so, we're going to examine several images of New Testament manuscripts. Okay. We're going to look at several pictures of some of the oldest New Testament manuscripts that exist today. We're going to talk about different kinds of manuscripts that come down to us and how those manuscripts are utilized in terms of helping us understand what the text of the Bible ought to read. We're going to talk about scribal practices and scribal tendencies. How did the scribes go about their work when they would copy a text and pass it down, right? And all of this really falls under the rubric, under the umbrella of a discipline, a sub-discipline within New Testament studies called textual criticism. Now, textual criticism is just simply the examination of how we got the New Testament, how it was preserved and passed down. And it's also the examination of the range of variant readings or the range of different editions of the New Testament as they were passed down, as they were transmitted down to us. Now, an older generation of scholars, and maybe even some contemporary scholars, might say that textual criticism is about finding the original reading. How did it come off the hand of Paul or off the hand of the author of Mark's Gospel or whatever text you're looking at? That idea of getting back to the originality of the text, that's a pretty complicated idea. It's a very problematic idea in some ways. We can get into that a little bit. I think it's more responsible to say that textual criticism is about the range of various readings that are passed down and how those different readings are transmitted through the life of faith communities. So let's start with a little activity. I wonder, now that I've primed you all to go get your Bibles, I wonder if someone would be so bold to look up for us Romans 16:24. Could someone look that verse up and read it to us? I told you we'd start with a little bit of Paul. We're going to enter in through Romans, and then we're going to go off in another direction. If someone could be so bold to turn to Romans 16:24 and read it for us.
Yeah,
Yes, go ahead. Yeah, thank you.
you said 24,
Yeah,
16 and 24.
chapter 16, verse 24. Yeah.
You know, the one that I don't have in my Bible.
You don't have it in your Bible?
No, I don't
23,
either.
25.
What's wrong with your Bible?
Mine
Is
goes
this the trick?
from,
It's a bit of a trick.
Yeah, you
I
got a smirk on your face.
I have Bible Gateway open and it's not in there either.
It's not okay. What translation do you have, Linda, on Bible Gateway? Or owner, what translation do you have?
New Revised Standard Version.
New Revised Standard. That's what I have here too. And my Bible is like yours. It does not have verse 24.
So a trick question.
It's a bit of a trick question. It's maybe actually a conundrum. Where did verse 24 go? Well, surely the chapter must end then. Is there a verse 25 in your Bibles? There is. What happened to verse 24?
maybe people didn't agree with what was said in verse 24.
Okay, okay. So who would have the audacity to take out verse 24 then? Let me ask this question. Do any of you have a little footnote, perhaps at the end of verse 23?
I do not.
No? Okay.
Mine
Candace,
says
what's
other.
oh, yeah, just one thing. Candace, what translation do you have? Just
I have
curious.
the ESV.
Interesting. The ESV doesn't have a footnote. Maybe at the start of verse 25, would there be a footnote?
Nope.
Interesting. So, I'm sorry, owner, I cut you off. What?
All my footnote says, the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with all of you.
Yeah.
Amen.
Same as mine.
And
Okay.
further on, others put verse 24 after verse 27.
Oh, okay. So
And the verse also adds, to the only wise God be the glory through Jesus Christ forever. Amen.
now those sound like pretty good words of scripture, not terribly controversial. Probably not that someone decided to take them out because they seemed controversial. But yes, you're right. My footnote, let me just find it here. My footnote says other ancient authorities say, and then it goes on. Other ancient authorities add verse 24, and then it cites verse 24. Interesting. Okay, this is what we're going to get into here tonight. This question of the text that comes down to us that we read on a Sunday morning, right? We take it for granted that it's there in the Bible. But how did it come down to us? And what were the processes of it coming down? This verse 24, which is omitted from the text itself, relegated to a footnote. In fact, not even relegated to a footnote in the ESV, as Candace has noted for us. What's going on there? Why is it in some Bibles and not in others? In fact, does anyone have a King James Bible? It's okay if you don't. It's not a translation that is read in some circles or not as commonly read in some circles. If we were to look up this verse in a King James, here I'm going a bit off memory, I suspect that it would be there. We can come back to that later. But why would verse 24 be in some Bibles and not in another? Well, let's get into that question tonight. To get into that, I'm going to go to my next slide here, and I want to tell a bit of a story. Now, this story is, in its broad strokes, an accurate story, although the specifics of it might be contested and might not actually be historically accurate. But this captures for us the broad sort of essence of what's going on here. This part we are pretty confident about, that in the mid-50s CE, so just shy of 2,000 years ago, in the mid-50s CE, a fellow named Paul wrote a letter from Corinth to a community of Christ followers in Rome. I'm going to put that on the screen like this. This fellow Paul was shacked up in Corinth for a little bit, hanging out with some friends there. And in the midst of that, he wrote a letter that was sent to the city of Rome. And when that letter got to Rome, it was read, it was performed in the church in Rome. And you can see there that I've put a solid red dot on the city of Rome. And then I've put this kind of transparent sort of aura around the dots because, people travel in and out of the city. Maybe as they're traveling in and out, they attend the Christ-believing community on a Sunday. They hear this letter of Paul being read. And so that letter has a kind of sphere of influence, let's say. That letter gets to be sort of known and read around the general area of Rome. Well, this is what we would call the original manuscript of Romans, right? It's sent from Corinth to Rome. It's the document written, well, Paul didn't actually write the letter to the Romans. He discloses to us that he had an amanuensis, a kind of a scribe who wrote it to him. He wrote it for him. He was dictating it, and this person wrote it. But this is the letter that Paul sends, the original manuscript. Now, Romans is a beautiful letter. It's one of the most theologically rich texts of the New Testament. It is a letter that has inspired Christ believers for centuries. And so Romans, it's read in the church in Rome. It has the sphere of influence that spreads out from Rome. And as people come in and out of Rome, they hear it. And maybe they say, boy, I'd really like to take that letter back to my community so we can read it, so we can be inspired by it. And so this causes the early church to make copies of that original letter. One maybe goes down the coast to another area of Italy where it's read and has its own sphere of influence. Another maybe is taken back to Corinth where it's read. We know Corinth, this area here of the Aegean Sea. This is particularly a hotbed of Paul and his activities. So a letter goes back to Corinth, maybe one goes to Ephesus. And these communities now are reading Paul's letter to the Romans, but they're not reading the original one that was sent to Rome. They're reading a copy of that, right? Well, each of these letters has its own sort of sphere of influence, and people travel in and out of Ephesus, one of the largest ports in the ancient Mediterranean. They travel in and out of Corinth, a major center in the area there of Greece. They hear the letter, they want a copy, and so now more copies are made. But these aren't copies of the original, these are copies of copies, which then gets circulated in a number of cities all around the ancient Mediterranean. I think you can see where I'm going with this. The way the New Testament was preserved and passed down was through the creation of copies of texts, copies of copies of copies of copies. Each time copies are made, those copies are done by human actors. Let me just interject for a second. We're talking about the 50s CE. We are certainly here pre-computer, right? You can't just copy and paste, Control C, Control V, right? We also are pre-printing press. Printing press from the 16th century, right? The printing press where you can take letters and align them exactly in the order you want, slap some ink on there and run off 100 copies, and they are all with great precision exactly the same because the machine has been set up to make them all exactly the same. We are here talking about a period of history that predates any of this machinery that allows us to have reliable copying. Instead, what we're left with is human actors copying these texts by hand. And as you can imagine, when human actors are involved, it creates opportunities for maybe some errors, maybe some mistakes, maybe intentional changes, right? Let's just pause for a second. What do we read in that footnote of Romans 16:24? Other ancient authorities read, right? Other copies, other ancient copies of Romans have this verse in there, and some don't. Come back to that in a second. Okay, so let me go to the next slide here. This is a table that is taken out of a handbook of New Testament textual criticism, a book that talks about the history of the New Testament text. What this table outlines for us is the number of manuscripts that come down to us, the number of New Testament manuscripts that come down to us. Now, I want to be clear here. This table comes from 1989, so it's about 35 years old or thereabouts, almost 40 years old, right? There have been other manuscripts found. So the numbers here are a little bit dated. The numbers are a little bit higher today because we have found other New Testament manuscripts. But by and large, this is the ballpark of the number of New Testament manuscripts. And you can see here that there are three categories of New Testament manuscripts. There are papyri, uncials, and minuscules. Uncials, it's a fancy word for capital letters, okay? Texts that are written with all capital letters, okay? Minuscules, or miniatures, are texts that are written with a mixture of both upper and lowercase letters, okay? Three different types of manuscripts: papyri, uncials, and minuscules. Papyri are our oldest texts, and we're going to look at some in a second. You can see the earliest papyri date to the 2nd century CE. And they go till about the 8th century, okay? Uncials, our earliest uncials date to the 2nd or 3rd century, but then start to proliferate as we get into the 4th, 5th, 6th, etc. And they go until about the 11th century. Minuscules, these texts that are written with a mixture of upper and lowercase letters, really come about in the 9th century. And then, the vast majority of our New Testament texts are in this category. The vast majority of these texts are relatively late, right? 13th, 14th, 15th century, right? Let's just go back to that date that I threw out there earlier. And we know that date with a fair degree of accuracy. In the 50s CE, Paul wrote to the Romans. Notice when our earliest manuscripts are? 2nd century. Sorry, Zoom just decided to give me a thumbs up. I guess Zoom likes what I'm saying. And Marianne hasn't muted me yet, so that's a good thing. Paul writes in the 1st century. Our earliest New Testament manuscripts all come from the 2nd century. The vast majority of the New Testament texts were written in the 1st century. Let's just pause on this table for a second. What that is indicating to us is that the texts that we receive, the texts that come down to us, which eventually are translated into the Bible that we have, none of those texts are the originals, what scholars call the autograph. Autograph meaning the text that came from the hand of the author. The only thing we have are the copies of the copies of the copies of the copies of the copies, right? I mean, any of these texts from any of these later centuries are copies of copies, right? In other words, the Bible we receive, the texts that were written down, are the products of scribes doing the work of copying these texts. If there's any questions or comment, feel free to put your hand up or unmute. I'm really happy to have a dialogue. But yeah. So let's talk about these. Well, I want to go into each of these categories: papyri first, then uncials, then minuscules. We're going to look at each different kind of ancient text and talk a little bit about their characteristics and what they're like. First of all, papyri. Papyri are called such because they're written on pieces of papyrus. Okay. Now, papyrus is made from the papyrus plants, which here I've got an image. It's just an image I found on Google. You can see these tall shoots in the back here, right? This is the papyrus plant. The papyrus plant grows in abundance in the Nile Delta of Egypt, a very central sort of economic hub of the ancient Mediterranean, which is the world that the New Testament was written in. Papyrus plants could grow to a height of 6 meters tall. I mean, the image I've shown here, these aren't 6 meter tall papyrus plants. But they can grow quite tall. And the stalk of a papyrus plant is quite, I'll say stringy. It's kind of like a stalk of celery, that has like a ribbed sort of string in it, right? Or maybe like a bamboo, right? You can take the papyrus stalk and you can cut it straight down and get these really thin sort of strips that you can take those strips and you can lay them out like this. And you can lay some other strips across it the other way. So that's creating this kind of hash like this. And if you press it together with enough pressure for enough time, that it kind of joins together and it'll make a piece of what comes to be known as papyrus, kind of like a piece of paper that is quite pliable and it's quite flexible and can be cut to whatever size you want and it can be written on. One of the big exports of Egypt in the ancient world was the export of papyrus and sheets of papyrus because this was a very sort of useful writing material that ancient folk could use. I'm going to go to the next slide here. This is an ancient piece of papyrus that you can see people have written on. I've given us this image. This is not a biblical image, okay? It doesn't have anything of the New Testament in it. Instead, this is um, a memorandum from Alexandria. It was written by an individual who's recounting their recent trip to Alexandria. Among other things, it talks about bargaining with merchants and just what they did when they were in Alexandria. I'm sharing it with us for two reasons. Well, I guess three reasons. First of all, when we talk about these manuscripts, these papyri that come from the second or third or fourth century, this is the kind of thing we're talking about. It's something like this, something that's fragmentary, something that we maybe have only a little piece, right? Maybe we have a larger bit, but something that has not withstood sort of the rigors of time, right? That's the first reason. The second reason, you can really see the physical makeup of a sheet of papyrus here, right? You can see these strings that go vertically and horizontally, right? This is a piece that through the ravages of time has been damaged and bits have pulled off. But as it's pulled off, it's betraying something of the character of how the this writing surface was created. The third reason I'm sharing it with us is to say that this piece of papyrus, which is not biblical, as I said, this is just someone writing about their trip to Alexandria. This piece of papyrus comes from the 1st century CE. This is as old as the time of Jesus, as the time of Paul. Just let that sink in for a second. That's pretty amazing. Here's an ancient piece of everyday life that survives today. It is as old as the events that one reads about in the New Testament, or as old as the words of the New Testament itself. Just something to note. Okay, let's look at another piece of papyrus, P75. This is the Bodmer papyrus. This comes from the 3rd century. It's a little bit later, about 200 years later than the one we just looked at from the P Duke 45V. This papyrus is biblical. Okay. You can see the writing. First of all, this piece is much better preserved, right? There is some corruption at the edge up here and along these edges here. But we really, and over at the top left here, but we get quite a bit of text, right? This isn't quite as fragmentary as the one I showed us on the left, right? We know it's biblical because when you read the Greek and translate it, it's biblical, right? In fact, you can see the text at the top here is about 5 or so lines. And then there's a break, right? You can see an empty spot here. And this bit here at the end says kata Lukan, according to Luke. And then there's this break. And then this bit here says kata Ionan, according to John. Oh, interesting. This is a manuscript that is of the Gospels. In fact, not just an individual gospel, a collection of gospels. The collection of gospels that comes down to us in our New Testament, where you have the end of the Gospel of Luke, the beginning of the Gospel of John. These two texts bound together here, part of a larger set of manuscripts. The Bodmer papyri are quite famous. They're some of the oldest extant, it's one of the oldest extant collections of the Gospels that comes down to us. As I said, it's dated to the early 3rd century. To say it's dated to the early 3rd century, the Gospels were all written somewhere in the late 1st, early 2nd century. Maybe scholars debate the dates, but let's say 70 to about 110 CE. So if this is early 3rd century, that would be like, let's say 225. So this manuscript is within 150 years of the writing of the Gospels. That's pretty close, right? Like I said, we don't have any of the autographs, any of the original texts. All we have are copies of copies, and this is getting us pretty darn close to those originals. Really beautiful manuscript here. Okay, let's look at one more. One more piece of papyri, and then we'll move to some unseals. Okay. This is the St. John's fragment, P52. I've given it to us here. There's both a recto and a verso, okay, a front and a back. And so I've given us an image of each side. You can see it looks like a mirror. It's published, it's produced writing on each side. This is just a few short verses. John 18, a couple verses on one side, a couple verses on the other side. This is a piece of papyrus that, as the word I used earlier, it's fragmentary, meaning that we have only a fragment. We don't have the rest of the text. This is all that survives from this copy of John's Gospel, is this little fragment, right? You can see the dimensions of it I've given us there on the screen, about 9 centimeters by 6 centimeters, right? Sorry, 9 centimeters by 6 centimeters. It's about the size of a credit card. I mean, it's just a wee little fragment. This this fragment, this St. John's fragment, P52, is one of the more famous New Testament manuscripts that survives. One of the most famous New Testament manuscripts that survive today. Because for a long time, scholars believe that this was the oldest surviving New Testament manuscript in the world. Back in I believe it was the early 20th century, this fragment was dated to about 125 CE. Now, this fragment has since been redated. It's been examined again and looked at with a critical lens, and that date has moved a little bit later in the second century, so maybe as late as 175. I believe it's still thought to be second century, just maybe not early second century as the original scholarly dating was. But for a long time, this was quite a significant New Testament manuscript because here, brass tacks, this is as close as we get to the original, right? This is, if not the oldest, certainly one of the oldest New Testament manuscripts that survives today. And all it is this little fragment, the size of a credit card, that's got portions of 5 verses that just cut in mid-sentence, and you only get the little bits in between, right? Um, this manuscript is housed at the University of Manchester in the UK. I did my PhD at the University of Manchester, and I remember when I went to see this for the first time. I was a first-year PhD student, and it's on display at the university, or at the John Rylands Library, which is a special collections library that's part of the university. And it's preserved in a glass case, so you can see it from all sides. And inside that glass case are two pieces of glass that are pressed against each other, and in between those pieces of glass are the fragment, and it's kind of suspended. I remember seeing it and thinking, I felt like I was stepping into the presence of something holy. This is the oldest manuscript we have of the Bible. I mean, it was just, I remember feeling a bit weak in the knees as I stood before this, just observing it. And I went back to a meeting with my doctoral supervisor, with one of my doctoral supervisors, and I told him, I just went to see the St. John's fragment, and he said, "Yeah, it's spectacular." He said, "I don't think it'll ever be moved because if they ever took the pressed glass apart and subjected this again to the elements, to the air," he said it would probably just disintegrate, right? I mean, that's how fragile this is, right? Um, you think about the gravity of the text, and this is how it comes down to us. Okay, so these are the papyri, or these are some examples of papyri. They are all written on, they get their name because they're written on sheets of papyrus. And sheets of papyrus are created from that plant, the papyrus plant. And as such, it's a man-made material. It's an organic material. And as such, it is subject to decay over time. And so by nature of that, the manuscripts that come down to us, the papyrus manuscripts that come down to us, are then very sort of fragile and fragmentary. So this creates this interesting conundrum that our oldest manuscripts, the ones that we would want to go back to, right? We want to get back to the originals. We want to get back, I shouldn't say to the originals, we want to get back as far as we can. Those tend to be the most fragile. That brings us to the next category, unseals. And here I'm going to just show us this beautiful image. Codex Sinaiticus, 4th century CE. Codex Sinaiticus, which is noteworthy because it's one of our oldest fully bound Bibles. It includes both the Old Testament and the New Testament. And it has a couple other books included in there too. The Epistle of Barnabas, the Shepherd of Hermas. These are non-canonical texts that at this time were read as part of the biblical canon, or at least put alongside of biblical books. Unseals are noteworthy for a lot of reasons. First of all, look what comes down to us. This is much more significant than these individual fragments that come down, right? Part of this reflects a different period in the life of the church, a period where there's maybe a bit more money available to produce better quality copies using better quality materials and these kinds of things, right? I should say the binding of this is secondary. The spine and the cover, that's not original to the 4th century. That has been redone at some point in the history of this manuscript, but certainly the pages themselves date to the 4th century. The pages themselves are not papyrus. Rather, they are vellum. They're made of leather, right? Made of animal hide. So here, I mean, look at the number of pages here reflecting a period in the life of the church where there's a bit more capital available to purchase more expensive materials, right? To be able to write on them. Notice the way this text is written in columns, a lot like our contemporary Bibles, right? Which are still written in columns, although some Bibles break away from that. I think the ESV tends to maybe go margin to margin, not necessarily in columns. So this is part of the tradition of how this manuscript comes down. There's a few reasons why they do this, and we'll get into those in a second. You also see all kinds of notes in the margins here. We're going to zoom into these in a second, but you can see you've got the biblical text, right? And then these notes alongside. They say these are not study notes, as though someone were reading along and thought, oh, I'm going to write a little note in the margin there. These are scribal notes. These are scribal comments about the text, and we'll get into some of those. Let's zoom in a bit. Okay, I've given us a bit of a zoom in on the left where you can see the lines of text, and then a really clear high-res image right up next to the script on the right there. Okay, just a few interesting comments about this. First of all, let's say why the columns? Well, in part because the columns mimic another ancient media type that was common for some biblical texts, particularly in the Hebrew Bible, the scroll. A scroll is a text that you roll, right? And by definition of that, you roll a bit and you read a column, and you roll a bit more and you read another column. You roll a bit more, you read another column. These are all presented as a codex, as codices, which are more like a book where you have writing on both sides, okay? But there's quite a bit of writing there. So rather than going the full length of the page, they keep that column structure in some ways to mimic a scroll, but also to make the text readable. What do you notice about the Greek here? Now, I fully recognize that many of us might not know Greek, but just visually looking at it, one of the things that sticks out at me is that there are no spaces between the words. It looks just like a bunch of letters all in a row, right? That's interesting. The reason why that is that we are dealing here with a period of time. Again, this is pre-computer. This is pre-printing press, right? This is a period of time when the vast majority of the population is illiterate, where the vast majority of the population does not have access to books or to written texts. Instead, what this population has access to are oral traditions and oral stories. Stories are told and retold and heard. And so a text like this is not used for private individual consumption or private individual study. Rather, a text like this is used for reading aloud in the community of faith. It's a pretty small minority within the population that had the capacity to read. And their capacity to read was not to read something that hadn't been read before, but their capacity to read was to perform the text for the community. And so a text like this is not intended to be able to read word to word to word in a kind of private, silent setting where you're reading in your head for private study. Rather, a text like this has liturgical function. It really exists as a memory aid. It really exists because of the sounds that the words make. Sounds that someone would have probably memorized much of this text, and they're just simply reading along and using this written text as a memory aid. Part of this also is the development of the Greek language. The Greek language at this time doesn't have these spaces in it. You might notice the script, all the letters look uniform and the same size. That's because they're all uppercase letters. These are uncials, capital letters, right? These manuscripts are all written in capital letters. You'll note also that there are very few punctuation marks or anything like that. If you really look closely, there's no periods, there's no commas. That punctuation does exist in Greek. It's not present here. There are some marks like this over here, this little umlaut that's above the iota here, right? But that's more of a breathing mark or an inflection mark. It tells you how to pronounce the vowel. In other words, it's a mark that's oriented toward the oral performance of the text, not toward the sort of grammatical accuracy of the text. I mean, this is a really interesting, these manuscripts are really interesting because they invite us into a different world, a different space, a different set of values, a different cultural system, all oriented around the biblical text that we share, that we read today, but totally different way of approaching it and seeing it. I'll make a couple other quick comments and then we'll move on. Notice here this little letter that seems to be erased, right? Clearly a scribal error. And some other scribe, some other orator came along and read it and said, oh, wait a minute, there shouldn't be a beta there. Scratch that out. This says ton huion, which is the Son, probably referring to Jesus, I would imagine, right? Son of God. Ton beta huion, that's not there's no Greek word that would be huion or just beta by itself. And so a little scribal error that gets scratched out, right? I'll just go back for a second. In fact, you can see a little bit of it here in the columns since we're zoomed in. You can see little marks like this. I don't know if you can see my mouse or over here or something noted here, right? We'll go back one slide. All these marks in the side here. These are places where scribes who live maybe, I don't know, 50 years after this text was produced, those scribes are reading the text out loud to a community of faith and they realize, oh, this wording is a little different than the wording I know. And so they put a little note that, oh, this text should actually be read in this way, or this verse should actually say this instead of that, right? So that's what these little scribal marks are. Okay. All right, those are uncials. Let's look at a couple more. Minuscules. Again, minuscules meaning lowercase letters. Okay. Here is a manuscript from the 15th century, quite late, a thousand years after the one I just showed you, right? This is a big time change, right? And you can just look at the text and you see, oh my goodness, this comes from another period in the life of the church. First of all, it's a very ornate text. There's color, there's images, right? These beautiful drawings that are part of the text here. This giant A, it's actually an alpha. And the first word, this is of Mark's gospel. This is the opening of Mark's gospel. Arche is the first word there, arche. Arche tu evangeliu, the beginning of the good news, right? And so that first letter, arche, right there. These little images drawn in here. Here, let me see if I can zoom in here. Did that zoom for all of you? Yeah. Anyone have an idea who this figure is? What was that, Linda?
I say Jesus.
That's a good guess. It's not Jesus, actually. That's a good guess, though. You know, that's the Sunday school answer. Often it's right, but this is actually John the Baptist. In the opening verses of Mark's Gospel, being the beginning of the good news, a couple verses later, John came proclaiming, right? Here's John showing up with his hand raised and his fingers gesturing in the way that one is proclaiming a message, right? Very much reflective from a different period, an aesthetically beautiful period of the life of the church, right? And we also see the developments here in the Greek language, where you have letters of different sizes, right? You have, if any of you were to read Greek, you would look immediately and see, oh, these are lowercase letters, right? This is a lowercase gamma gamma here. This is a lowercase mu right here, right? Not only lowercase letters, we have punctuation. Here's a period, right? Let's see, another period here. It's a semicolon here, okay? A Greek semicolon. We have accent marks, more than just umlauts. We have breathing marks, we have accent marks, right? We also have early indications of verses. They're not yet numbered, but early indication of verses, right? These little red dots, they come between different sections, right? Not yet numbered, but an early indication of that, right? Zoom back out. Show us another one. This one from the 12th century, again, minuscules. You see the punctuation. You see, oh, I should have said the spaces between the words, right? We see that this is the evolution of the Greek language, right? And that evolution is reflected in the manuscripts. I've given us this image because it's kind of interesting to see the finger of the scholar that's holding the page open here. You get a sense of how large that manuscript might be, right? Just the size of I don't know, a small scribbler or that kind of thing, right? Okay, these are minuscules. So let's talk, hold on, how am I doing for time here? Don't have my phone with me. It's okay. Okay, let's talk a little bit about text types. So all of these are different kinds of manuscripts that come down to us. We have papyri, uncials, and minuscules. And what we find through the history of these 3,000 or so manuscripts being passed down is you have different types of scholarly or scribal activity that happens throughout the life of the New Testament's transmission. You have in principle, there are roughly three broad types of manuscripts or manuscript traditions. You have texts that are associated with the city of Alexandria, which is right there right by the Nile, right in northern Africa, in the area of Egypt. Alexandrian manuscripts are our oldest manuscripts. They come from the 2nd to 6th century CE. These are manuscripts that, given their age, we tend to want to prioritize because there's this sort of innate bias that says we want to get back to the most ancient manuscripts. Alexandrian manuscripts are noted for their brevity. They tend to be shorter in length. They tend not to be polished grammatically, meaning that there might be sentence constructions that are a little bit awkward or a little bit nonsensical, right? They have stylistic difficulties in the way they're written. And many of our most ancient and most authoritative manuscripts are deemed to come from this Alexandrian tradition. So that beautiful manuscript, that beautiful codex that I showed us, Codex Sinaiticus, that's an Alexandrian text. That beautiful Bodmer papyrus, that full page we saw with Luke and John on it, that's an Alexandrian text. Okay, these tend to be our oldest manuscripts. They tend to be quite grammatically and stylistically rough at times, which often for scholars suggests that that might be an indication that these are more original texts, right? As opposed to some of our later manuscripts, like manuscripts that come from the Western tradition, which were localized particularly in Rome and all the activity of Christianity in Rome. These manuscripts come from the 2nd to 9th century, so a little bit later. These manuscripts have a tendency that they tend to paraphrase. A scribe working in Rome might take some more liberties with the text. That where an Alexandrian manuscript is a bit stylistically difficult, a Western text might paraphrase that difficulty or smooth it out. Why? Because the primary function of the text is its performance in the church, its utility in the church, its capacity for people to understand it. And so these scribes working in the Western tradition tend to paraphrase or change or omit words or phrases. Maybe they'll harmonize passages. Like, for instance, if you have Jesus doing and saying one thing in Mark's gospel and doing and saying something contrary in John's gospel, then a Western scribe might harmonize those passages, right? This Western tradition is what was eventually brought up and used in the Old Latin version of the Bible, particularly the Vulgate. Okay. There's a third tradition, which is located in it's the Byzantine tradition, located in Byzantium, or before that, Constantinople. And this is the broadest range of manuscripts from the 5th to 16th century. Now, these manuscripts are characterized for their lucidity, for their completeness. They're very well maintained, and they're very clear and easy to read. Where there are difficult readings in the Alexandrian text, these readings are smoothed out. Passages might be conflated with one another because you don't want these confusions over maybe what Jesus said, and so they bring these texts together. This Byzantium tradition, it's these Greek manuscripts that were used by Luther and by Tyndale when they were making their original translations into German and into English, respectively. It was also these Byzantine texts that were utilized to produce the King James Bible. Now, I said earlier that Romans 16:24 verse is probably in a King James Bible. It's because at some point in the copying and recopying and recopying and recopying of Romans, at some point that verse 24 got added in. Well, actually, that's the question. Did it get added in or did it get taken out? Chances are it got added in by a scholar working in the Western tradition or in the Byzantine tradition, right? Looking to create more lucidity, more completeness, maybe looking to align Romans with other texts of the New Testaments. And this is a place where there's maybe a scribal reason for adding that verse. And when I said I think the verse is in the King James Bible, it's because that this Byzantine tradition was the tradition from which the King James was translated. And so that verse is present there in that tradition. Whereas other manuscripts, particularly those that come out of the Alexandrian tradition, the verse wasn't there. Okay, so I want to highlight one final version of the New Testament for us, and then I want to come back to Romans 16:24. The last version of the New Testament that I want to highlight for us is the modern Greek New Testaments, which I've got a copy of it right here. And this is the Greek New Testament from which the NRSV is translated, from which the ESV is translated, from which the NIV is translated, and several other contemporary translations. Okay. This version of the Greek New Testament was first created in 1831. It is called an eclectic text. And what I mean by that, what scholars mean by that, is it is not a text that was received through any one tradition of copying, right? Let's go back here. Say, this Textus Receptus here, the received text, which was the Greek text that Luther worked from and Tyndale worked from, the King James Version was translated from. That's a text that was passed down in the Byzantine tradition, copied and recopied and recopied and recopied. It was a text of the church. It was a confessional text that was passed down, that was the received text by the church. Instead, what modern scholars have done is they've said, we're not quite sure which version is original. So let's create an eclectic text, which tries to take all the manuscripts that are out there and look at each word in the New Testament one by one and make a decision about which manuscript has the more original reading or not. The way these scholars work, these textual critics work, is they take an Alexandrian text like Sinaiticus, which we saw earlier, that beautiful large folio. They take an Alexandrian text as the starting point. Because if I go back, the Alexandrian texts are the ones they tend to be shorter, they tend to have less corrections, they're a bit more rough around the edges. They very much are a good sort of starting point, okay? Take that Alexandrian text as our starting points, and then go through verse by verse, clause by clause, word by word, and look at all the potential other readings that are out there from the Byzantine tradition, from the Western tradition, from other Alexandrian texts, and make a decision step by step on which reading is original, which reading is more original than other readings. Okay. So this image I've given us here, I'll try to zoom in. This is just a single page out of the modern Greek New Testaments. Okay. It's all written, at least the text is all in Greek. There's no translation here. You can see there's verses, right? 7, 8. This is the Gospel of Mark, Kata Markon, chapter 1, verses 7 to 15. Okay. And you can see the way this is laid out. The actual Greek text is here. Okay. On the right, there's a column of cross references, right? What are other verses that in the New Testament that you might want to look at to understand Mark 1:7 or understand Mark 1:8, right? And then down below, there's this thing here that's full of all kinds of symbols and numbers and sigla. This is it's called the critical apparatus. This is where this eclectic text really comes together, because what you do is you read along, okay, and you hit a little sigla here, a little symbol. That symbol corresponds down here. And what it tells you is that at that point, the manuscript traditions differ, right? One set of traditions, one set of manuscripts say this. And then here's this little double dot here. Another set of manuscripts omit it. That's the line, right? And this hard line, this would be the next entry here, right? So this is very much a critical scientific text. This is a text that scholars use to interpret the New Testament, to translate the New Testament. This is a text that says our best educated estimation of what the New Testament should read is here, but there are places where the manuscript tradition has lots of different readings, and we feel the reader ought to know about that. Hence why we have all these notes down here about very alternate readings. Which brings us back to Romans 16:24. Because not all of these variants end up in the footnotes of our New Testament, but some of them do, especially when you've got a verse that seems to be omitted. Going back to the trick question, where did verse 24 go? Well, in the tradition of the church, it was originally there, but after 1831, as scholars began to look at the vast majority of manuscripts and critically assess what the text of the New Testament should say, there's good reason to say verse 24 probably wasn't original. It was probably added later. So it probably shouldn't be in the text of the New Testament. It shouldn't be in this bit up here. But it's going to raise suspicions or questions when someone's reading along and all of a sudden it skips a verse. So we'll put it in the footnotes. And some people maybe do want to read it. And it's not theologically terribly controversial. So we'll put it in the footnotes so people can see it there, right? Okay, yeah, I've done a deep dive into textual criticism, not for the faint of heart. Question, I'd love to know. Yeah. Yeah, owner, yeah.
Not a question, it's a comment. It is in the 1611 King
Okay.
James.
Thank you. Thank you for checking that. I thought my suspicion was that it would be, and I appreciate you confirming that. Thank you. Yeah.
So what did the Romans use for language, as in written language?
Yeah, yeah. So the Roman Empire, I mean, the city of Rome, Latin is the traditional language of the city of Rome. But when Rome branched out and took over much of the ancient Mediterranean, they were taking the ancient Mediterranean from a variety of different Greek rulers who were in control around the Mediterranean. And the Greeks before the Romans had done this essential thing, which is that they made Greek the primary language that was spoken all across the Mediterranean. And the Romans were they were a pragmatic bunch. You know, they came in and said, "Why would we force everyone to learn Latin when everyone is already functioning with Greek? Let's just keep Greek as the lingua franca, as the primary language that's spoken across the Mediterranean." So, uh, the New Testament comes down to us written in Greek because that was the primary language of the day. That was the language that most people spoke, and that for those who could read, this was a universal language that these texts could be passed around and shared, right? Um, but the actual language of Rome was Latin. The primary language of Rome was Latin. Yeah. And the New Testament becomes translated later on into Latin. The famous translation being the Vulgate, right? Um, just as the New Testament is translated into Syriac and Coptic and several other ancient languages. The table I gave you of New Testament manuscripts, that's a table of Greek manuscripts, of manuscripts written in Greek. There are other tables, of Latin versions and Coptic versions and Old Church Slavonic and all these different other ancient languages that the New Testament was translated into. But of the Greek manuscripts, those are the ones. Yeah, Candace.
Um, so I'm just wondering, because lots of things get dug up and stuff. So if they
Yeah.
found a new manuscript today,
Yeah.
what would happen? Like how would they would they authenticate it from? Like what
Yeah.
would be the criteria to say, yes, this should be in the Bible?
Yeah. Okay. So you just used the magic word criteria, which there's a slide I haven't shared yet. I didn't know if I was going long, but since you mentioned it, I'll go there. Let me say this text that I'm showing you here, this is the 28th edition. The first edition was made in 1831. And since 1831, there have been 28 editions of the New Testament. So this is very much uh, a live feature of New Testament scholarship, is to say, as we find more and more manuscripts, we need to take those into account. They need to be added to the critical apparatus. They need to, each new manuscript is going to shed new lights on what the readings of the text might be. And with each edition, new editions are released when there are enough, when the weight of a certain reading maybe has enough evidence to say we ought to change what the text is, what the New Testament text reads. And so the question of criteria, I'm going to just skip. There are different types of variants. I'll skip over that. But the question of criteria, here are the criteria that go into this decision-making process. So the first question is, what are the number of witnesses? Let's say you're dealing with a text, Romans 16:24, and you've got 30 manuscripts that have verse 24 in it, and only 5 that don't have it. Well, your first criteria is the number of witnesses. And maybe you want to go with the majority, right? 30 manuscripts have it in there. Okay, maybe we should go with that, right? But then you move on to a second criteria. Well, what are the age of those witnesses? Maybe the 30 that have it are all really late, right? But the 5 that don't have it are really early. Well, that shifts the weight maybe on the side of those 5 that don't have it, right? We get into the next criteria. What are the quality of these witnesses? By witnesses, I mean of these manuscripts, right? So if the 30 manuscripts, if those manuscripts are known for, let's say, expanding the text, right? Maybe that speaks against the credibility of the reading. Whereas if the 5, the minority, are known for being accurate in a number of other contexts, maybe that gives credibility to those 5, right? Questions of the geographical spread of the witnesses. Are all the readings found in one area? Maybe are they all Western texts? But the 5 really old ones, do they come from multiple different places, right? It's possible that some manuscripts develop and get copied and copied and copied because they're insular, right? They're like in a specific location, and that's just the text that's known there, and so that's what gets duplicated again and again and again. But if a reading is really widespread, right, we're seeing the same reading happening in multiple manuscripts from around the ancient Mediterranean, well, that gives credibility to a reading if it's widespread. Another criteria is the difficulty of the reading. This is a little bit of a contested criteria, but it's a criteria that I think makes some sense. The basic idea here is that if a verse is difficult to read, maybe stylistically it's a bit awkward, or the grammar is awkward, the language isn't very good. Scholars will give priority to a difficult reading than they will to a smooth or easy or polished reading. And the reason they do that is it's more likely to imagine a scribe cleaning up a text so that it could be read and understood than it would be to imagine a scribe obscuring a text to make it difficult to understand. So by default, a more difficult reading would take priority in terms of criteria than a smooth reading. And then the last one is conformity to known style. This is a bit like the quality of the witness. Does a particular reading correspond to what we know a manuscript tends to do? For instance, does a manuscript tend to elaborate or expand or add in certain kinds of words or that kind of thing, right? So if we take these criteria, and here I'll actually put Romans 16:24 back on, the first thing we can say is that the presence of verse 24 is in a number of manuscripts. If we just went on the number of witnesses, the criteria of the number of witnesses, we would put verse 24 in there because it's in more manuscripts than it's not in, okay? A high number of witnesses have it. But we want to look at the age. All of these texts, the earliest one comes from the 6th century, right? We have much earlier manuscripts from 200 CE or from the 4th and 5th century. All of these manuscripts omit verse 24. So age is a key criteria here. The oldest manuscripts don't have verse 24. And then the last criteria I'll mention here is that Romans 16:24 sounds a lot like 2 Timothy 3:18. Scholars have noted that the two verses are very, very similar. And it raises questions for scholars. Raises the question, is it possible that a later scribe added verse 24 to make Romans maybe align with 2 Timothy, or make 2 Timothy align with Romans? In other words, there could be theological reasons that this was added. So that might speak to the quality of the witnesses, right? Or the conformity to known style. That certain scribes work with tendencies to maybe harmonize passages across the canon. It's more likely, again, coming back to criteria, it's more likely that that the omission of this verse, it makes it more difficult. It makes it a little bit less harmonized, and so that maybe gives some favor on the side of it being omitted. So those are some of the criteria that would go into this one example that I've outlined for us.
Thank you.
Other comments or thoughts? I hope at the very least I've encouraged you to not just gloss over those footnotes in your Bibles. Take a look at them. Sometimes they have all kinds of interesting little interpretive nuggets and tidbits. I mean, a really famous one, we've not gotten into it, is the ending of Mark's gospel, which famously has multiple endings. And if you go and you look at the ending of Mark's gospel, it ends. Where does Mark's gospel end? Mark's gospel ends with the women at the tomb turning away out of fear and saying nothing to anyone. In fact, the ending of Mark's gospel reads, they left, they said nothing to no one because they were afraid. Full stop, period. The word gospel, euangelion, which is how Mark's gospel begins. We read it earlier. Arche ton euangelion, the beginning of the good news. The word gospel means good news. In fact, it has the implication of something you proclaim. It's the image of someone running into a city and yelling something out, proclaiming good news. And yet Mark's gospel ends in silence and fear. It's a complete contrast between the start and end of Mark's gospel. And for many for many scribes, that's a really strange place to end the good news, right? So Mark's gospel famously has multiple endings. If you go and you read Mark 16, there are 3 different places that the gospel potentially ends. And what your Bible will say in terms of the notes is it'll say some ancient manuscripts end the gospel at verse 8, I think it is. Some ancient manuscripts extend verse 8 and put a nice little bow on the gospel. The women said nothing, but then they went and talked about it, and the gospel spread, the good news of Jesus spread around the world. A nice little bow at the end to kind of clean it up. Other manuscripts have another ending, and then there's a longer ending that's added on. And what this is exactly what we see going on here with Romans. Multiple manuscript traditions that find it difficult to imagine that the gospel ended with silence and fear. And so the tradition develops different sort of off-ramps, let's say, different endings for Mark's gospel. That's a really famous example. Romans 16:24 is a much subtler, smaller example.
Are there any other questions? Again, this is your chance to ask a New Testament scholar anything you want about the New Testament. Sorry, Fred. Put you on
No,
the
it's
spot.
okay.
You reference, it says, could verse 24 be a quote from 2 Timothy 3:18? But there isn't an 18.
Is there not? Sorry, I'm going off my notes here, but I must have maybe I wrote the note
But it
wrong.
said,
Let me just
I don't see it. I see 17. Second Timothy 3,
Let's
17.
take a look
I don't
here.
see verse 18.
1 second.
So I wondered if that would be good.
2 Timothy 3:18.
Ben, oh,
Uh, my mistake. I'll have to double check that reference. So, thank you, Gail, for pointing that out. I'll double check the reference. I I put these notes together some time ago, so forgive me.
No. I just thought maybe you were doing another little,
Yeah. How deep does the rabbit hole go here?
exactly.
are there any other questions? Oh, yes, Dan.
Is there a short version that when did we come up with all the verses and chapters?
Yeah, I believe those were added when the King James was translated. I have to confess, I'm not 100% certain, but I believe they
Okay,
were added with the King James.
it's a good
Um,
answer.
it- yeah, I mean, yeah, as good as any. Uh, we saw some early indications of that with those red dots in that one manuscript, right? Um,
What made me think of it?
yeah, but I'm pretty sure it was with the King James. Just 1 second, I have a book here, 1624. Yeah, Gail, I'll have to look into that for 2 Timothy reference there. But yeah, Dan, I believe that they were with the King James.
Okie dokie.
Okay, are there any final questions? Um, okay, I'm not seeing anything. Um, so Ted, Fred, thank you. Did you have a final slide or conclusion?
I do. I mean,
Yeah.
I guess the last point I would make is, as I said at the start, this didn't fall from heaven, right? The New Testament, I mean, the way that I think is helpful for me to think of it is that this is a living text. I mean, we often want to think about the New Testament as a freeze-dried, accurate, stale text that hasn't changed. Certainly, some sectors of the Christian tradition will talk about the Word of God being strong and consistent and stable. Well, it's a living text. It's a text that has been a part of the life of the church for thousands of years, right? It's a text that is there to serve the life of the church. And for many Christians throughout space and time, it's a text that could be adjusted, right? And utilized for the life of the church. I mean, we receive this text in a very scientific way. That image I showed us of the modern Greek New Testament, it's a very scientific text. It's very different than that beautiful ornate image of the beginning of the Gospel of Mark with that little drawing of John the Baptist. The text we have reflects our current day, right? But it's a living tradition, one that has spoken to people of faith for hundreds and for thousands of years, which continues to speak today. In my mind, the sort of humanity of this process is part of the beauty of the text. It didn't just fall from heaven. It's a part of the life of our faith community for hundreds of years, which that's a nice note to end on, I think.
That's an amazing note. Thank you. Thank you so much, Fred. That was fantastic. Oh, I was in heaven. And I think everybody else was too. Because yes, and if anybody is at Christ Church and wants to see an NA 28, I have one sitting on my shelf.
Oh,
Yeah, well, couldn't go to school without it. Just thank you so much for giving up your time and for the presentation and for everything. I hope everyone got something. If you want to go back to it, of course, it will be on our YouTube channel, hopefully tomorrow. And our next session will be a week today, same time, same Zoom link, same day. But the speaker is just me, and I'm going to share some of my research with the narrative criticism of King David and Bathsheba. So we're moving into the Hebrew scriptures. We're moving sort of the opposite of textual criticism and the historical critical methods towards narrative criticism and the Bible as story. So I will talk a bit about that when we get to next week because I'll reference textual criticism because we do it with the Hebrew Bible too. Um, but yeah, we've got our own critical apparatus and everything. It's in Hebrew, not in Greek. But thank you so much, Fred, and thank you everybody for joining us. I hope this was informative and that, yeah, thank you. So I'll see you next week. So bye and thank you. Thank you so much, Fred.
Thank you, everyone. This is a
Thank you.
real treat for me. Have a great
Thank
night.
you. You too. Bye. Thank you.